Welcome to Life with David. I'm David, and today I'd like to take you on the journey that brought this wonderful Tyros 1 keyboard back to life. But more importantly, I'd like to show you that there was nothing special about these repairs and that anyone with basic troubleshooting skills and limited tools could perform them. So why don't you join me as we bring this keyboard back from the dead? I'd like to spend a moment on safety. There's nothing more important than keeping you and your loved ones safe. Be sure to read, understand, and follow the safety rules for your tools. Using your tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And always use the appropriate eye, hearing, and respiratory personal protective equipment. This time we're going to be working with line voltages. If you screw up, you can be seriously hurt or worse. Make sure you disconnect the power cord before you start to remove any panels. If you're following along, you're doing so at your own risk. And if you don't feel comfortable doing any of these activities, then don't. Now, let's get started. The Yamaha Tyros 1 was introduced in 2002 and stunned the industry with its sound, range, and capabilities. The previous owner bought it new and used it daily for many years. However, in 2018, it was dying. It would sometimes play for a while and then crash, and sometimes it wouldn't even turn on. The previous owner had taken it to the shop several times, but repairs were never completed since the replacement boards were no longer available, and troubleshooting the individual boards would have been cost prohibitive. Eventually, the owner decided to purchase a new Yamaha Tyros keyboard and gifted me the old one since he was going to trash it anyway. I gratefully accepted since I seldom shy away from a challenge. When I got the keyboard to my house, I noticed that it started working again. But that was short-lived. After a few days, it died again. Moving it sometimes fixed it for a while, but it always died again. It sounded like a loose connection. I did a little research on the internet, and problems with cold solder joints in the power supply had been reported. I downloaded the service manual and started to dive into the unit. There are two boards that make up the power supply, the switching power supply unit and the regulator board. Please forgive the quality of the video. This was in 2018 before I started my YouTube channel. Hopefully, I've learned a bit since then. After making sure the unit was disconnected from the power, I started the multi-step process of separating the top and bottom halves of the case. The service manual was an excellent guide. Since there are boards attached to both the top and the bottom of the case, I needed to remove several interconnecting jumpers and cables before I could separate the halves. I started by removing a couple access panels on the bottom of the case. Next, I removed the inlet lower box that houses the power inlet connections. Then I could disconnect several jumpers between the boards. Once the jumpers and cables were disconnected, I removed several dozen screws in order to separate the case top and bottom. Once they were out, I flipped the keyboard right side up and lifted the back of the top up and then forward to clear the keys. I carefully noted the routing of all the cables since they'll have to go back together again later. Next, it was time to get into the power supply. It's just in back of the keyboard. I removed these screws and lifted off the metal cover, exposing the switching power supply board. I removed the power supply board and inspected the solder joints on the back of the board, and they looked fine. Next, it's time for the regulator board. I suspect linear voltage regulators are the culprit. I've seen it in a lot of equipment. The linear regulators usually get pretty warm, and with repeated power on and off cycles, they thermally stress and eventually crack the solder joints. The fix for this type of failure is pretty simple. Just resolder the joints. Since I need to get to the bottom of the regulator board, I remove the screws, but I don't remove the wires and cables. I don't have a video of this step, so here's a simulation for your enjoyment. I removed the old solder from all the regulator connections and cleaned the connections. Then I used fresh electronic solder to resolder the joints. Finally, I cleaned the regulator board of flux using a little isopropyl alcohol and an old toothbrush. What's important is that you can do this repair yourself. These linear regulators are pretty rugged, so you can use any lightweight soldering iron, even a Harbor Freight $6 unit. There are lots of good videos on YouTube on how to solder. I'll leave a link to one in the description below. I prefer to remove the old solder before resoldering, but if you don't have a desoldering pump, you can either use desoldering wick or simply add a little fresh solder and stir the joint around a little to move any of the impurities to the surface. Just watch that you don't bridge any connections with excess solder and you don't get the traces too hot because you don't want them to lift off the board. I reassembled the boards, enclosures, and covers in the reverse order. Before I secured the top half, I made sure all the cables and jumpers were routed properly. Then I reinstalled the case, the cable connectors and jumpers, and then the access panels. The keyboard powered right up and has been working flawlessly since. However, the last time I used it, I noticed that the right monitor speaker wasn't working. Time to dig in again. I started troubleshooting by first swapping the monitor speakers to see if one speaker or its associated cable was the problem. But the problem did not follow the speaker, so the issue is ahead of the speaker output of the Tyros. Next, I listened to the keyboard using headphones. This time, both channels came through very clearly. I also checked the line outputs of the keyboard using a computer speaker, and both outputs worked fine. That means the problem must be somewhere between the line output and the speakers. So I turned to the service manual. Since the monitor speakers plug into the keyboard, I'd originally assumed that the monitor speakers were driven by an amplifier in the keyboard. I wasn't looking forward to opening up the keyboard again to fix the problem. However, much to my delight, I was wrong. The subwoofer contains the amplifiers for the speakers. The keyboard is just a fancy and very expensive jumper between the amplifier and the subwoofer and the speakers. So I removed the subwoofer backplate and carefully turned on the power. Note that there are line voltages present on this part of the amplifier when it's energized. I carefully started checking for signals going between the keyboard and the subwoofer while the keyboard was playing the demo. And just like that, I found that pin 5 of the 8-conductor mini DIN cable between the keyboard and the subwoofer had a broken conductor. I ordered a new cable, and that fixed the problem. Although I used an oscilloscope to check for signals, I could have just as easily used a simple volt-ohm meter to check for continuity of the cable. I would have found the damaged cable in a much less intrusive manner. This wasn't a very challenging repair, but it wasn't intuitive either. Although it took a bit of digging into the service manual to isolate the problem, the repair itself was trivial. I've included a link to the service manual in the description below. In my experience, many of the problems I've seen with modern electronics have been through mechanical failure resulting in a lack of continuity. Things like broken wires, bad switches or relays, or cracked solder joints. Leaky electrolytic capacitors have also caused some issues. I found solid-state compounds and resistors to be relatively trouble-free. But for now, the Tyros is back in full operation. Thanks for joining me today. This time we made a couple repairs to the Yamaha Tyros 1 keyboard. The main thing I wanted to convey is you don't need fancy test equipment to chase down most electronic problems. Anyone with basic skills and good documentation could perform these repairs. If you're unsure about your ability, build confidence by reviewing the service manual and then remove a couple of the access panels to appear inside the keyboard. If that goes well, you can move forward and you might find you actually enjoy the whole troubleshooting process. Just be safe. You can do it. If you like this video, or you think someone else might, please give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. The more likes this video has, the more YouTube will recommend it to others. Also, please leave a comment or suggestion for things to do. I hope to do more of these videos, so please subscribe and click on the bell for notifications of new videos. Let's get together next time for another day in Life with David. See you soon.